Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Labaria, and welcome to part 11 of the Bigelow Aerospace document leak series. Okay, as you can see in my little image here, we have the 10-month report and Dr. Jacques Vallee, why he's on here, along with, you know, the Roswell crash, as depicted by X-Files, will be parent as we go on. Once again, this whole series is cumulative, right? So if you're watching part 11, I'm going to assume you've watched part 1 through 10, okay? Because I'm not going to go over what I went through in those older videos. I'm going to continue where I left off, essentially. Okay. So I want to focus once again on what I think is the most important paragraph of this 500-page report. Um, Going back to the $22 million underground camouflage storage facility that Bigelow Aerospace intended to make in order to receive the crashed UFO hardware from Lockheed Martin. Okay. They were going to receive alien technology essentially from Lockheed Martin. Um, and they had a whole storage facility. Now, the term exotic material is really interesting because in this 500-page document, it only appears one other time. Okay. And it is in the abstract to this DIRD. Okay. The Maverick Inventor versus Corporate Inventor DIRD. Now you can read this Defense Intelligence Reference document for yourself just by going to DIA FOIA and going to the UFO and exotic technology section, and it's right there. Okay. Now, what does it say about exotic materials? Well, it says that it is now the case that new and exotic materials and their dimensions are driving the quality and quantity of energy and propulsion innovations and preventing the average inventor from contributing new and useful forms and assemblies. In other words, based on our past videos, if anyone's going to crack zero point energy, if anyone's going to crack anti-gravity, it's not going to happen in their garage. And it's not going to happen at some small, laboratory. Okay. Why? Because they need exotic materials. Specifically, they need materials from recovered hardware, from crashed UFOs. Okay. As we've gone over before. And, anti-gravity, the UFO propulsion, UFO energy sources are not a physics problem. They're an engineering problem. Okay, specifically a material science problem. So no, maverick inventor, no super genius is going to crack this without the right materials. Okay, and those were the kinds of materials Bigelow Aerospace was hoping to receive from Lockheed Martin until they were blocked by the CIA. And remember, OSAP was a Defense Intelligence Agency classified program. Okay. What would these materials have looked like? Well, we can look at some of the other DIRDs, what they expected to receive. Certain kinds of metallic glasses, certain kinds of metamaterials useful in energy harvesting, programmable matter, okay, so-called smart materials that can self-repair, self-assemble, shapeshift, change function. I'm going to get into that in the next video after this. Now, Jacques Vallée, why is he important? Well, because he, along with Hal Puthoff, are two of the people who were part of OSAP program, which have come out in public and admitted that they were in OSAP. Okay, I've erased the other people who, as far as I know, haven't gone public, but these five you see here have gone public, and Jacques Vallée is one of them. So he was part of OSAP. And remember, OSAP was a catcher's mitt to receive alien technology from crash retrievals that Lockheed Martin has in its possession. Okay, on behalf of the federal government. Okay, now Jacques Vallée has a very interesting journal entry, which we went over before. Okay. Again, It's the oral tradition he received from Ron Blackburn, who received it from Paul Tyler, while Ron Blackburn was working at the Skunk Works for Lockheed Martin, right? Namely that UFOs should be studied from the point of view of energy, consciousness, and form, or form is negotiable, and that the Roswell crash was a true crash. Now, 2 months before that, Ron Blackburn also told Jacques Vallee something very interesting. Okay, from this March 5th, 1990 entry in Jacques Vallee's published journals. And remember, this was published before UFO mania was popping off. Okay. Um, Jacques Vallee says, I asked Ron about his involvement with Roswell. He assured me he knew a man who did radiation tests on the crash material. Quote, it was amazing. He had a piece as large as this room, and he could lift it with one hand. The fellow is afraid to talk about it. I believe this most likely is Ron Blackburn himself. Okay, that this guy that Ron Blackburn knows is Ron Blackburn. Because as we'll see later, Jacques Vallée has a way of conveying confidential information without betraying confidences. Okay. Why do I think this most likely is Ron Blackburn? Well, let's look at what this fellow supposedly did, right? The man he knew did radiation tests on the crash material. Ron Blackburn is a radiation guy. Okay. If you go on Google Patents, you can find one of his old patents, okay, which uses microwave radiation to effectively eliminate sonic boom, okay, when an aircraft goes supersonic. So at least that's the idea. So in this patented technology, supposedly what it does, it either gets, eliminates a sonic boom or reduces it. How? By having the jet shoot microwave radiation from the nose and the tail fin. Okay. Um, Now, when you keep in mind the circles Ron Blackburn is running in, this is almost certainly inspired by the UFO phenomenon, right? Because UFOs go much faster than the speed of sound, but they don't have sonic booms. Okay. And UFOs are radioactive. Okay, UFOs, when they've landed, they've irradiated ground and plants and people who have gotten close enough to touch them. Okay. So you have the supersonic, no sonic boom, radioactivity. This is all inspired by the UFO phenomenon. And if that wasn't obvious enough, look at figure 3. Okay. Look at figure 3 from this patent. It looks like a flying saucer, which is interesting, right? So Ron Blackburn is a radiation guy. Okay, that's what he does. Okay, so he again, working at Lockheed Martin at the Skunk Works, presuming they do have this material, would have been qualified to do radiation tests on the crash material. Also, the fellow is afraid to talk about it. Well, Ron Blackburn appears to have been a high functioning paranoiac, and we'll see why. Okay, let's go back to Journal Colonel John Alexander, okay, who convened the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. Uh, this is from the Oak Shannon Notes back in 1985. There's John Alexander, there's Hal Puthoff, um, who at the time was running the CIA psychic spy program. And then there's Ron Blackburn, okay, representing what might be called the Lockheed contingent, Lockheed group in this, meeting of the minds. It was trying to crack the UFO phenomena. Now, this is Colonel John Alexander, Dr. John Alexander. He's a PhD. This is his UFO memoir, right? His insights from decades of studying this phenomenon. And this is what he says about Colonel Dr. Ron Blackburn. Among the people I met was Dr. Ron Blackburn, a retired U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel who was then working at the Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California. Tall, rail thin, and bespectacled, Blackburn was as close to a functional paranoid as one can be. While I had evidence that the KGB previously had intercepted some of my calls and acted on them, Blackburn just always assumed someone was listening. When meeting in hotel rooms, he would compulsively unscrew the voice end of the handset and remove the components, even though there was no classified discussion ongoing. Now, you have to ask yourself, how would Ron Blackburn, okay, who, and by all appearances, a very high functioning person, right? He has a PhD, right? He was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was working for Skunk Works, which means he also had kind of the moral fiber, the character you would need to have the security clearances that you would need to work there. Why is he a functional paranoia? Why is he, unscrewing the voice ends of handsets in hotel room telephones? Well, because he had handled material from the Roswell crash. He had done radiation tests on the materials, and he was saying things he shouldn't have been saying, right? He was saying things he shouldn't have been saying. And if you're doing that, and you're concerned for your freedom and safety, then you might act a little paranoid. Okay, especially if you're intelligent. Okay, so that's why I think Ron Blackburn is the person in question here. Okay, he's a radiation scientist, paranoid, and he was working at the Skunk Works in Burbank. Okay, why is that important? Well, Burbank is a stone's throw from the city of Chatsworth. Okay, put a pin in that. I'm going to show you now why Chatsworth is so important. That's Dr. Jim Ryder from our last episode. Okay. Um, and as we talked about in the last episode, he was the one trying to facilitate the tech transfer of alien hardware from Lockheed Martin to Bigelow Aerospace. Okay, and then it was blocked by the CIA. Um, Hal Puthoff implicitly said so. Grush explicitly said so. And there's Jim Ryder and Hal Puthoff together. Okay, that's important to understand going forward. That Jim Ryder was the VP of Lockheed Martin. He was talking to the OSAP people during the OSAP program in order to facilitate this tech transfer. Okay. Now, Jacques Vallee was an OSAP. These are Jacques Vallee's most recently published journals. Now, look at the entry for January 2012. I'll read it for you. My inquiries about the sightings near Palmdale have led me to a certain retired vice president at Lockheed Martin, a colleague of legendary aircraft designer Bob Rich, founder of the Skunk Works. They were once in charge of studying materials picked up from crashes in Nevada. Old story, he said. The method is simple. The Air Force would call them as cleared contractors indicating where the objects were. They would go out with trucks, gather them up, and study the materials. For some reason, funding halted and the stuff was stored away, like the Ark of the Covenant at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. For a while, as the rumor goes, it was held at Class 3 storage facilities near Chatsworth. There was a contract to maintain the secure lockers. It didn't support science. So why was the research stopped? Here again, there's a straightforward answer. Military brass often shows a fundamentalist bias, where events like saucer intervention smell strongly of evil influence. But why not expose it then? I can only speculate about the answers. Until November and December, we thought Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies was close to reopening our project. Bob begged his contacts to help create an appropriate SAP, which only the CIA or the Air Force can do at this level to restart quests. Okay. Chatsworth. Okay. Ron Blackburn was at the right place, geographically speaking, and at the right company to have access to that material. Now, um, this again, it's Jim Ryder. Jim Ryder is the VP of Lockheed Martin in question. Okay. How many VPs are there at Lockheed? How many of them were talking to the OSAP people at the right time? Okay. How many of them were going to, Lucis Trust and giving talks about UFOs? Okay. It's Jim Ryder. Okay. And, this stuff apparently it's the materials, right? The materials that were gathered up from the crash field. Okay. Um, they're stored away in crates, collecting dust, right? And why is that? Because apparently some people in the Air Force, high-ranking officers are fundamentalist evangelical Christians who think that if something is paranormal, it either comes from God or it comes from the devil, right? It's very binary thinking. And again, if we look at the OSAP stuff we've reviewed in earlier episodes, right? If you're a fundamentalist and you look at the world through the keyhole of the Bible, um, you can understand why someone would see that, right? I don't look at the world that way, but if you were, you could understand why someone would come to that conclusion. And yeah, Bob's contacts is none other than Harry Reid, as we went over in the last episode, right? So there you go. Okay. Some of this material um, was had by Lockheed Martin. It was going to be transferred to Bigelow Aerospace. Okay. The exotic material, okay, needed to make advances, leaps and bounds in energy and propulsion, um, was going to be transferred to Bigelow Aerospace. It got blocked by the CIA. And Ron Blackburn, back in the 80s and 90s, apparently, um, was lucky enough to hold some of it in his hand. Okay. So that's it for today. Um, Join us for our next episode. As always, I always like to leave you with an exhortation. Remember that your consciousness is not classified. The mysteries of mysteries cannot be hidden in a storage crate in Chatsworth, California. Thank you and good night.